is a fun day, a fun evening for us, and that is because every once in a while we do a distinguished lecture. And today I'm happy to introduce Jean-Paul Rodrigue, who is from Montreal and insists upon having his name pronounced correctly, which is really hard for me. But he's here from Hofstra University on the East Coast. Some of you who know about our Metro Freight Center of Excellence, Jean-Paul is our team leader for the New York group as part of that international consortium. We've started working together on this project. We just realized we've been at it for almost a year, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah, it's depressing.
And depressing, yeah. Anyway, I want to introduce Jean-Paul. He has a Ph.D. in transport geography, which of course is my favorite subject, right? From the University of Montreal, and he's been at Hofstra University for some years. He's an amazingly prolific author. He has authored 5 books, 25 book chapters, and more than 40 peer-reviewed papers, not to speak of the reports and everything else. In addition to all of that, he has actually been recognized in many ways. He's on editorial boards and so on. And this past year, he was just appointed to sit on the advisory board of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. So that's a really cool thing. I want to take the opportunity also to let you know that Jean-Paul has, I think, the best faculty website of anybody I know. He has put all of his information from his books, from his research, from his everything online. And so you can actually read his book, read his chapters online at any time. And he updates it constantly. So every time there's a graphic and it goes to the year 2011, if you look a few months later, it's up to 2012. He has also collected several data sets that he just keeps up himself. And some of that I think you're going to talk about probably tonight. So as I say, in addition to all the wonderful publications and everything else and his accomplishments, he also has gotten over the tech barrier and is teaching the rest of us on how, in terms of how we should actually do this. So with no further talk, I want to introduce him. He's going to talk about something that I hope is really interesting. It's always interesting to me. But there's this concept of economic waves. And he's going to be talking about containerization in the context of this theory about economic waves. So with that, Jean-Paul. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's see if I can stand somewhere where that block. Oh, you okay? You don't matter anyway. Okay. Thank you, Genevieve. It was a nice introduction. Glad to be here. It's, let's say, nicer than New York weather-wise, I would say. And maybe personality-wise, possibly also, I must say. So I'm going to talk about the box. And I was not too sure what type of audience to expect. Because I know that some of you eat boxes for breakfast. And many of you maybe are much less familiar. So I'm going to give you some kind of an overview of what I call the waves of containerization, because you have to look at many of those processes, development process, diffusion from a nonlinear perspective. Because a lot of errors when people do planning, for instance, is that they consider things in a linear fashion. They have their 2, 3, 5% patterns, growth scenarios. And we did some study about this, and we found out that all those forecasting, can I say that, attempt at one thing in common. And you can guess what it is. They're all wrong. And that's really entertaining when you start to look at what's the matter behind this, and you start to realize that when you are at the beginning of a wave, you tend to underestimate trends because you're not too sure how they unfold. And when you are at the end of a wave, or when you're in a full-fledged growth, now you start to overestimate the future. And then you have, again, you always think linearly. So we're going to talk about this. This is actually part of it is a paper that I've which is a co-author with a French colleague of mine, which is David Guerrero from Paris University. So I have to at least pay some credit here a little bit. So allow me to move on. Again, there was a recent article about The Economist, in The Economist, which labeled a container the humble hero. And it's a very appropriate term, because there's not that many things that has changed so much, and while so few people are acknowledging it, in a sense. And that box, even if it's simple, it's actually reflecting very complex issues, because it's many things at the same time. It's of course, you can transport things about this, but also people also manage supply chains in container batches. Again, you have different elements, different views about how do you handle these boxes. And this is simply a simple representation of those benefits. We call that, I call it the multiplier of globalization. If we were still with break bulk, standard break bulk, the global economy would have been impossible. China would have been impossible. All the export-oriented economy. This would have been completely infeasible. So you have to acknowledge that after 50 years of containerization, that this humble hero has made a tremendous contribution to, let's say, global trade and the process of globalization from different perspectives, and they're very well known in terms of course, the first obvious one is transportation costs. This is very well known. There are plenty of evidence that mentions that containerization dropped transport costs by a factor of 20 times in some cases. That's easy to assess. What I find something very, very interesting, and people fail to realize this, is containerization has changed the rule of the game in terms of what load unit you need to be involved with to participate in global trade. That is, prior to containerization, you had to have be quite a big player to be able to export or to import. But now with container, what you need is the minimum load unit is essentially one box. If you can fill up one box, you can trade. So what do we start to observe, and I have a few research projects about this, let's say in the Midwest, for instance, in Western Canada, you start to have small slaughterhouses able to export meat to China or to Japan, because they're able to fill 1 or 2 or 3 boxes per week, and that's all they needed. Suddenly they were beforehand not a player at all, and suddenly became a global player. They found themselves a niche. So there are a lot of interesting ramifications behind this process. Of course, we talk about inventory cost, which is very interesting. That is, the container becomes a management unit. It's a storage. It's a warehouse. And I saw a lot of very interesting ways that this box is used for inventory purposes. Sometimes at the terminal itself, they use the terminal as a warehouse. And I've seen that taking place in Europe, for instance, when you have an inland terminal and the containers at the inland terminal, and they say, why you keep it there for a week, 2 weeks, when you not bring it to your warehouse? Why should I do that? It's there for free or a very low cost. I'm going to call the box when I need it. And again, I'm going to bring it up because it's very nearby. So you see things popping out in ways that you do not see coming. I have a question for you. Some of you know very well. What is America's leading containerized export? Okay, you're right. We sell nice, fresh American hair that goes all the way to, okay. But let's say if there's something in the container except fresh air, what is the leading export? No. You see it pretty much every day. We export trash, waste product. And when you observe what is the Pacific trade, it's the biggest recycling system in human history. I call it the garbage in, garbage out system. What I mean by this, the major importers are obviously the usual suspects. Walmart, Home Depot, so garbage in. Those products, I'm sorry. Try to entertain the audience here a little bit in the evening. My jokes are funnier when you have a couple of glasses of wine. So enjoy. So you have this. So the product has been consumed and then discarded. Then this garbage has been collected and then brought across the Pacific back to Asia, especially China, to be reintroduced in the supply chain, to be recycled and brought back. So it's a very interesting loop. Again, I'm not too sure how efficient it is, but actually that's something I found very interesting. Again, without a container, such patterns, such systems will not exist. So is that sustainable? Because it's a recycling system. China has been very good at taking all the waste product of North America, waste metals and so on and so forth, bring them back and reusing them for something else. So let's move on. So this is what I meant in the sense that the container is a transport unit. It is a production unit, depending upon who you are. From people that say they're not concerned about a container as a movement, they're concerned about containerization or container as something that you manage production with. You organize your production to fit container batches exactly. I saw car manufacturers that have redesigned their distribution as soon as they went globally to make their goods, to make their batches, their parts fit well into a container. So that again, you have to measure that. And then, of course, the container is a distribution unit, and it's, of course, a warehousing unit. You use it for storage purposes. And for instance, when you do some advice, because the big name these days in terms of containerization, or the big trend, is what we call inland ports. They're popping out all over the place around the world. And when you advise them, say, what type of strategy? You say, give them a lot of free time, demurrage time, because it enables them to use this facility as some kind of a store for storage purposes. And help them plan their supply chain accordingly. Again, you cannot do that at congested area, but if you have space, do it or so. So yeah, consider container from such a perspective. Here, I won't go to do this into details. You try to combine, or let's say compile a list of what are the advantages, and they're pretty well known. It's standardized, which is very useful. Of course, it's flexible. I've seen everything imaginable being put into a container. Amazing. Again, waste paper, I saw coal. Again, if you study transport economics, that does not compute. But when you have an imbalanced trade, you have a lower rate for outbound flows, when you have very specific trade emerging, you see these type of issues taking place, of stuff you would not expect being moved into containers. So grain also is a very active trade. Obviously, we talk about cost, speed, warehousing, security. All these issues have contribute pretty well to the diffusion of the container as a transport and supply chain management unit. Again, this is stuff coming straight from our website. However, there are plenty also of challenges related to that damn box. That is, the whole process of containerization has created a new form of space, which is you need a lot of storage, a lot of flat areas in order to handle these volumes. So it has forced some kind of subarborization process across the world. This is pretty well known, has been studied for the last 20, 30 years or so, that port facilities were forced, sometimes, depends on the setting, to move to new sites because the ancient sites were no longer suitable for container use. Plenty of examples. I can give you an example of New York, that the port has completely shifted. The port of New York is in New Jersey, just again because of those requirements. It's capital intensive. That's a very big issue in developing economies, and this brings the growing importance of what we call global terminal operators. That is, since it's a capital and knowledge and skill-specific industry, there are a lot of firms that have emerged which are specializing into the handling of those or the management of those terminal facilities, and they're bidding for concessions all over the world to establish themselves. Because they come with deep pockets often, and they have a very interesting, global perspective about the management of their assets. Some of them are backed by pension funds. Some of them are backed by sovereign wealth funds. We did recently a study about all the global terminal operators. We built a database about them, and we're shocked how much they were 4 players completely globalized, controlling something like 35 to 40% of the global trade by about 4 terminal operators. Were assets, they were positioned, and they had a global strategy. And when they were willing to invest, they invest. And if they want, they're going to build a port out of nowhere if it fits their strategy. Again, for example, recently, I think the port in Costa Rica, the port of Limon Wine, will be built by APM, which is let's say a parent company of Maersk, which is the world's largest shipping company. And why they built that port? Simply because they want to ship bananas to the United States. Simple. It's cold chain logistics. Build a port mainly for that form of logistics. And again, when it fits their strategy, they're going to provide the capital. So many developing countries feel a little bit uneasy because most of the time ports used to be deeply regional, deeply national issues under the control of local or national interests. But these players coming in the game are shifting the dynamics, I would say, quite substantially. This is one of the biggest problems about containerization. It's an unsolvable problem. It's the imbalance in flows. At the global level, about 20% of all the container moves are empty. And what can you do? Nothing, because it's linked with trade imbalances. You have trade imbalances, you have container flow imbalances. You can try whatever you want in terms of cargo rotation strategy, some form of attempt to rebalance the trade. But as long as you have, let's say, an American economy which is deeply retail-oriented, import-oriented, which have limited exports, at least that can be containerized, you're going to be facing this problem. And obviously on the other side of the equation, you have other countries which have another problem, which is, in that case, you have to reposition their empty containers in those locations. So there's a list of terms. I don't want to spend too much time, again, just to give you a brief introduction, because, again, I was not expecting, I did not know which audience I was talking about, as we say in Canadian. Okay, so this is another project we are undertaking, and we were, again, surprised, shocked, that we don't know. Very little evidence has been found so far. What are the actual growth factors behind containerization? Some are well known. I'll give an example. This is well known. Transportation is a derived demand. Duh. Okay? So global trade increases, more international transaction. So of course, with globalization, with outsourcing, with international supply chain, fragmentation of supply chain, global production network, China, okay? Because of that, you get more flows. Fair enough, easy to understand. What we're not too sure, again, that was a very important factor initially in the containerization process. That containerization began as a substitution of the break bulk. It used to be very inefficient, so you containerize, you make it efficient. So substitution was the driving factor, and then it disappeared. Because everything that could be containerized became containerized. Then we're starting a new form of substitution taking place in containerization, which involves these days commodities are start to be containerized. Grain, for instance, I was talking about coal, chemicals, talk about meat product, refrigerated goods. This is this is a new form of substitution, because these type of trade used to be evolving or taking part of their own specific ships, which were bulk carriers, and now they're being containerized. So again, another substitution effect is at play here, and we're not exactly sure to what extent the commodity trade can be containerized. I get phone calls from people in Colorado who would like to export coal in containers. Okay, can we containerize oil? No, you get all those questions, because when you have a capacity issue and you have a problem with pipelines, you start to say, what are the alternatives? So you get all sorts of ideas or plans or strategies, again, if they come true or not is another story, about what can be containerized, because the container is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. Again, some places it's easier to get than others. So what can we put in that box? And sometimes we're surprised. And again, I didn't know it, but I did not realize that 98% of all the coffee traded in the world is containerized. And this took place over the last few years, a decade or so. It was, anything that can be containerized is becoming containerized. So the big question these days, to what extent the commodity trade can be substituted or can be containerized. And then we'll see, is it 5%, is it 10% of the grain trade, or 25%? God knows. But that difference will make a very, very big deal, for instance, for the United States, which is a major resource exporter. So if those resources are more containerized, it will create opportunity. But of course, this comes with other issues, which are very interesting in terms of the size and the weight factor. The classic cubing out and weighting out problem. I won't delve into these issues here, but again, those are slightly problems. Again, another form of trade, which is incidental. That is, if I'm telling you that 20% of the global trade, let's say, moving a container are empties, this is a demand, which is simply incidental. As long as there are trade imbalances, that demand will exist. But what happens if you have a rectification of trade imbalances because of, let's say, currency fluctuation, major recessions? Let's say, the thing I have these days is China is over. What I mean by this is the labor cost advantage of China is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller. I think there was a publication, a piece published in the New York Times just about a month ago, which demonstrated the textile sector, for several aspects of it, it was now cheaper to go to the South of the United States. If you start to do that, your trade balance starts to shift, and this incidental demand now starts to change. So a lot of ports which are in the business of relocating fresh air, you get a less cargo because of these supply chains. So again, we're not too sure about this. And the last form of trade, which is also very interesting, is what we call induced containerized trade, because of the hubbing effect. Some of you may not be aware of this, but a lot of the containerized flows are not necessarily point to point. It doesn't make sense. You have to organize that in some kind of pendulum services, milk run if you wish. But many shipping lines also organize their distribution nation or continental wide from transshipment hub and spoke. That is like in the airlines, exactly what the airline do. So this happens also in containerized shipping. And for the last 20 years or so, you saw the emergence of those massive transshipment hubs. You heard about places such as Dubai. Singapore, 98% of all the traffic in Singapore is simply a ship to ship. Because it collects the whole region and then it reshuffles stuff. The biggest growing transshipment hub these days in the Americas is a tiny little place which LA doesn't like very much. No, Transshipment is not a transshipment hub. Don't care about transshipment. It's just a niche. Maybe it's 1 million TEU at most. It's not a big deal. I know it's annoying, I know, but no, it's Panama. The growth of Panama as a transshipment hub has been amazing. Since the last 5 or 6 years, I think tripling of the transshipment function of Panama. So again, with the expansion of the Panama Canal, it's going to be interesting. Because guess what all the East Coast ports want, they're going to get? They're going to get those big, nice post-Panamax or new Panamax ships coming right away across Asia to the Panama Canal, waving past LA on their way. and then directly, let's say, to Miami, yes. Up to Hampton Roads, up to Baltimore, maybe. But the expansion of Panama Canal, in my opinion, was going to promote the growth of transshipment in the Caribbean and in Panama. And because it's going to be a reassessment of the bigger ship are going to dislodge smaller ships. So what do you do with the smaller ships? You put them on feeder services. And that, again, that's one likely scenario. When I say that to the newspapers and to the ports on the East Coast, they're pissed. Oops. I'm on record now. I'm done. Please delete the last 5 seconds because I'm gonna get a few phone calls next week. They're not very, because they have expectations about something else, and it's gonna. The decision. The point is, the ports do not make these decisions. It is the shipping lines that make those decisions. How they reposition and let's say position their assets. Or their assets, sorry. And the expansion of Panama Canal will create an area, or let's say a point in time where the shipping line will say, okay, now what do we do? How do we service North America? How do we service the East Coast? How do we service that tiny little market which is called South America from that perspective? And maybe what's going to happen is going to be different from what the East Coast and even the West Coast ports might expect or think about this. So those are the growth factors that we think are playing behind containerization. And then we're not too sure about their respective dynamism, their respective weight, but if we were able to understand each contribution, we would have a much better picture of what derives containerization across the world. Because these days, I suspect a lot of that business of many ports is based upon this, because this sucks, to be candid. Yeah, people think, I see growth plan, global trade, globalized. It's done. I don't expect much growth for Europe and North America in terms of demand, unless we get another real estate bubble. You want another one? So you can borrow money against the value of your value of your home to use your credit card to buy Chinese goods. So, okay, get another real estate bubble. We're going to get another consumption bubble. Otherwise, the last bubble we got, again, I don't see it coming that much. I might be wrong. So let's move on. Again, this is amazing in terms of the different scale of growth or impact, I must say. Just for fun, we did global population for 50 years, or let's say, sorry, that's 40 years, apologies. GDP, export, and container. So that you see different patterns. So for a small a growth of a population to 6 billion, you got a growth of the GDP, which was much higher, a growth of trade, which was much higher, and so which means there are multiplying effects, which are very, very interesting. But like any trend, any process, this is on my website. You don't need to take a photo. You just Google it. It's there, and all the explanation is there. Everything you see in front of you, it's written, available for free online. I call that open source in that case. Get a lot of plagiarism though, but you'll be surprised. I have some big problems with consultants. I call them copy and paste consultants. Okay, let's move on here. But like any growth trends, nothing is linear. You get a plateau. And this is what we start to observe these days. Is we start to observing, and we're not too sure if it's entirely correct, that for each additional unit of GDP growth, we get a lower growth rate of containerization. So it seems that we are reaching some kind of maturity in the process. Of course, this is region specific. Latin America, forget about it. Maturity is far away. But Europe, North America, and Japan are considered mature containerized market. What's also very interesting is the fact that we found out that the growth of number of container ports was a precursor to the growth of containerization. So which means it was, if we build it, they will come. Again, that's the global level. Be careful, I cannot draw specific regional, local conclusion about this, but the growth of port was very significant first, and then the traffic growth keep up. But again, that trend is over. We'll see very few new container ports emerging these days. And the level of concentration is peaking. It used to be containerization was becoming more and more the emergence of hub and spoke, big containerized hub, big ports, big gateways. This process of concentration peaked around the 1980s. And our hypothesis, it looks like it's going to drop the level of concentration as the global economy becomes more mature. So let's look at these waves. And I found waves very interesting. It's a very standard. If you study economics, you know about waves and cycles. That's pretty much basic stuff. But it is surprising how limited or how few people in the transportation sector consider waves as some form of paradigm to explain your system, your growth, or the behavior of that system. And if you look at the literature, you get those Kondratiev waves. Again, this is classic. It is linked with technological cycles, in a sense. So containerization, actually, we found out, fits almost perfectly in a Kondratiev wave. We saw a 40-50-year cycle for containerization. But we found also very interesting smaller waves. And, but we were able to prove it for the Kondratiev, but the other one we were not able at this point. We did not find very specific matches, but it matched well with long-term waves. But we have to focus more regionally if there are any specific pattern. But again, I don't want to dive into this today. So what it's been applied for? Most port development models consider cycles. There are ample literature that there are growth and expansion of the port, and then some kind of maturity and peak. This is very well known. We did some work also about a diffusion of containerization follows a wave, and I'm going to show you some evidence again today with this. So we have to look at this from a global picture, and this is again the idea of a wave. You have to keep this in mind because I'm shocked how well this applies to all of sorts of growth systems. Trade, diffusion of telecommunication, again, technological diffusion. And this also applies to containerization. It works like that. Again, what changed is can I say that, the range, the pattern, if it grows faster and slower, but it always depicts this form of behavior, which is reassuring because it's very simple. Adoption, acceleration, peak growth where everybody is in the game, and then at some point you reach a phase of maturity where the system has reached its optimal market potential and there's nothing much else that can be containerized. And then you have to reassess. You have a question?
This is most interesting. Do you think we're talking about diminishing marginal returns? Or are we talking about a cycle that automatically reinstitutes itself?
Again, that's the issue. We can only observe it to this point in time. Is there going to be another wave in the future could be the case. But again, I don't have much evidence at this point to mention. But you're right. At each level, this is where you have the highest level of return. You have the most, if you exclude the part, the most bang for the bucks, in a sense. But at the top, you're right. You reach diminishing return. You don't get much more out of the system. And that's the point, because you're saturated. Everybody's in the game. Yeah, plenty of ports are competing. What could be containerized has been containerized. At the same time, the economy itself, because the economy, the cycle of the economy is also linked with the cycle of containerization. So the economy is also reaching declining marginal returns, so there's less import, or let's say a saturation of imports and exports. Something else? Or?
If you modify the variables, the factors that go into the diminishing marginal returns, could you in fact, have you done any studies whether you could change the cycle, or does the cycle is independent of all of those?
I wish I could answer your question. I would make good money as a port consultant. That's an excellent question. But you're right. We have to find. We're gonna find out, in a sense. We're gonna find out. Okay. So this is what we need. And if we apply this perspective, I forgot. Sorry. I'll wait something. Get out. Damn. Shut up. Here we go. What we have to take in consideration, which is very interesting, is within those cycles, there are sub-cycles. There are areas of transition. So when do you switch from adoption to acceleration? And when do you switch from this to this? And when can you observe that you're switching between? So we try to look it up to see under what circumstance you have a phase of transition, a paradigm shift, which involves that your current business model is now shifting to something else. You're still in growing, but the pattern or the trade of that growth is now changing. And last and not least, which is very interesting, is within this, there's also a seasonality, which is excessively interesting. There are ports around the world which are called Christmas ports. You could set your watch with them. They are so obvious. The exact same pattern repeats itself on a seasonal basis. And there are other ports that have no such things. They are mostly actually transshipment hubs, which is a paradox, because when you advise people, you say, transshipment is the most stable business in terms of volume-wise, because it's stable, until a maritime shipping company changed its mind. And then you get yourself a heck of a hiccup. However, the gateway function is seasonal, but it is on a long term fairly stable because it's linked with the macroeconomic demand of an economy. So there are also little things like that you have to look things up. So if you apply this containerization, when you adopt, it is actually niche services. The containerization began as everything else as a niche, and then because you got productivity gain, then you start to have network development and productivity multipliers, issues that you were mentioning here. Then massive diffusion, networks, complexities, which forces you to develop transshipment hubs. And then at some point in time, you achieve maturity, and maturity, you go back to a niche market. And that's the point I mentioned. In this country, now you have to find what are the niches. Because forget about retail. It's not there anymore. It's going to be there. It's a major market. But the growth years, I suspect, are behind us. And plus, if we get the nearshoring process, because now the action is taking place, we are now observing a re-nationalization of North America, if you understand what I mean by this. Mexico was bypassed by China. But now they're reassessing and moving back now. So the trade function or the trade patterns are going to switch, are going to shift. And actually, one of the cheapest places to manufacture these days in the world is probably Detroit. I will not be surprised that we saw a reindustrialization with a different bang on North America with all these new technologies. Yes?
So I have a question. So my understanding is today's manufacturing process is that it's not like China makes the final product or Mexico is making the final product or the finished product. It's really like if you look at an iPhone, for example, different components that makes up the iPhone comes from all over the world. Something will come from Japan, something else comes from China, something else comes from Singapore, other parts of the world, and then all these pieces get imported into the United States, but not as a finished product, and some of that actually yet get exported to Mexico and then assembled even more and then imported back into the United States. So like there's no one specific country that's creating or manufacturing the
Again, it depends on the complexity of the product. iPhone is a very, again, but iPhone is not containerized, it's all air-based, a lot of it. So again, it does not have much of an impact about this. But you're right about supply chain, they are amazingly, I would say, amazingly complex. And each one is based upon decision made by manager. They all have their own game, their own rules, their own favorite areas to produce. And when they change their mind, you see sometimes a very radical shift. And what I suspect is right now a lot of supply chain managers, again, depending upon the sectors, but they are starting to re-question their strategies in light of rising costs, a lot of factors. And they say, hey, now let's consider other alternative. Should we get closer? Shall we now have more of a Latin America strategy behind this? And again, you're right. Products are insanely complex. And actually not that many of final assembly takes place in the United States. And I read some data somewhere that, for instance, with NAFTA, between Canada and the United States regarding the car manufacturing trade, I think a product will cross the border between 20 and 50 times as part of the assembly of a car. Not the same product, but all the parts involve 40 to 50 cross-border movements. So you can imagine with the maquiladoras here, the whole complexity behind this. But we're all outside containerization, but of course, part of that trade is containerized. So let's look at what's happening here. Again, it's obvious. Again, everything is S-shaped. What we don't know is when we get those inflection points. And right now, if you were talking with people in, let's say, in the 2005, 2006 about what is the future, they would have said to you, the future is this. So we need that capacity, we need to invest. And then came the real estate bubble, the financial crash, and so on and so forth. And everybody was caught literally with their pants down. And that was ugly, I must say. And right now, this is what we got. And this actually were the scenarios that we were contemplating, my colleagues and I. And actually, when I was giving some presentation a few years ago, I was showing that, people thought I was local. Out of my mind, say they're going to be a reassessment that you might need to consider this instead of this. And we got some, as usual, I was wrong. There's always something in between. And we're not too sure how much global containerized trade is going to rebound. And again, is this an indication that we are entering a phase of maturity? Or this was only a glitch and happy days are here again? And then we were wrong in the assessment. We are still in peak growth. I will not. Again, I'm not entirely comfortable to say we are in peak growth, but I'm open to say they could still be. Because the economy is full of surprises. Yes?
With your V there, it shows a very parallel recovery to the predicted, where we basically lost 5 years or so.
Yep, you're right. That could be simply something like this. We'll know. But in my opinion, I think more we're going to get something like this. Again, could be wrong. Could be wrong. But I suspect for North America and Europe, I'm very confident this is what we're going to get. But again, it would depend how much, let's say, Brazil, South Africa will contribute to this growing content. There's a lot of unleashed forces there that are going to be very interesting. Okay, let's move on. So allow me to bore you for a few minutes, if I've not done an excellent job of this so far. Now what we did is we built up a data set. We took all the container port in the world. I would say something like 400 container port for the last 40, 50 years, every single years. It's a big matrix, and it cost me quite a few gray hair to assemble, because some of you may be aware there are some industry sources such as Containerization International that publish container flow data, but we were shocked that in many of those data were a lot of errors. We were amazed about some of it was very unreliable in the past. Again, we did a lot of correction. We put it up together, and I checked with my colleagues at United Nations, and there was no such database. There was no global database of container ports. I was shocked. There are plenty of national, regional one which are maintained, for instance, by different the North American Association of Port Authorities as a very good database, maintained stuff. But we were shocked there was no comprehensive global database, so we tried to build one, and we're semi-successful. We have something which is fairly consistent. So we try to classify it. We say, in which, based upon all these patterns, all this growth, how can we find a pattern? Can we classify those waves, these phases? And we were able to. We were able to identify 5 waves of containerization based upon a methodology which is called, in that case, hierarchical cluster analysis. Okay, it's fairly common, standard, fairly easy. Again, it's a simple methodology, which is also very interesting. So simple stuff, good, interesting results. So we applied it, and we found those classes, and this is the evidence in terms of the dissimilarity. So we were with about, when we went below 5 classes, there was not that much gain in dissimilarity. So 5 classes was suitable. That's the point, according to this. So we're fine with this form of classification, I must say, with all these waves. So I would say 5 major waves, and some of them have 2 subwaves. And the difference was let's say the timeliness of this. And allow me to explain. So if we put all of this in terms of each of those waves and of the share of the container throughput, the first wave, of course, they are the pioneers. They dominate, and then they lose. Second wave, third wave, fifth wave. No, sorry. There are subwaves here. Third wave, fourth wave, fifth wave, which, again, I'm going to show you maps. This is simply a graph of putting all this data together in terms of all the different contributors, the different patterns to this growth. So the best way, because you look at a graph, you're confused, you're saying, what the heck is that? The best way is to show you this on a nice little map. And that's going to be fun. So let's talk about those waves. And this is one is quite apropos, as we say, because we're in California. So let's see about the long waves of containerization. So the first wave were the pioneers, the first port to adopt the containerization. And this is where, around the 1970s, this was the global container port picture. So they're all in the same category. It's mostly the economic triad. It was North America, Europe, Australia, Japan. We part of come a little bit later on, but it was still containerized there. So that's the first thing. And the main driver of this, of course, it was simply a substitution effect. That is, the container was still unproved technology. The ship most of the first container ship was simply converted cargo ships. Because when you test something, you're very, reluctant to commit to this. So now they were experimenting. So it was actually, the growth was simply, okay, what was break bulk now can become break bulk, but in a container. So that was the factor. Pretty easy to understand. The second wave, up to the 1980s. Now you start to have a diffusion. And this is that wave, this is the wave of also what we call the tigers. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. You start to see some action in the Caribbean, some action around the Mediterranean. So the driver of this wave is also fairly self-evident. It is now containerization start to be adopted massively. People understand now there are benefits. You start to see the first dedicated container ship are now fully released and into services. And the global economy starts to be, actually, it is at that point in time, around the 1980s, that the real process of globalization starts. You didn't get much of it, at least as far as containerization is concerned before. Third wave. This is when you start to see the setting of global supply chain, and we found out something very interesting in this wave. This is at that point that you see the emergence of transshipment hub as now part of the game. Because here's the issue. The first containerized service were almost sometimes point-to-point or very simple services. And as the ship grew bigger, as the network got more complicated, at some point you needed to face a rationalization of that network effect. So at that point, this is where places such as Singapore, places such as Colombo, which is a major transshipment hub, Dubai starts to emerge as a transshipment hub. Algeciras, for instance. You saw the emergence of these places which themselves do not generate or attract any cargo whatsoever, or very few, very little, but act as a connecting platform for the global economy. The other wave, it's very easy, we call it the China wave. almost all the growth. This is like around 2000, the massive entry of China as an export-oriented economy. And it's very clearly reflected in the pattern. Almost, I would say 60-70% of all the ports, the growth is taking place in China itself at that point in time. And so that's why we're calling it the China wave. So the driver, of course, the expansion of global supply chain, it's still China. It is also, again, the ongoing transshipment business, which is emerging. Then, yeah, okay. Then the last wave, again, we stopped in 2010. And we're not too sure, again, when we're going to start, I'm looking forward for 2015. I'm going to be a bit grayer, but also going to get a new data set where I'm going to be able to see to what extent these things are evolving. But now the last wave is, we call it the niche wave. It is the ports that emerge are either spillover ports, that were constructed because other ports were running out of capacity and then you have new port projects, or some kind of niche. And the only ports in the America, which is in this wave, is the one that LA doesn't like too much. It's that purple dot, that Barney dot, which is, of course, no, Prince Rupert. Prince Rupert, again, it's there. Otherwise, there's not that many, I would say. So again, we have not that much data behind this, but this is so far what we can do. And again, the point we are observing here is that it's something, we're reaching some form of peak growth in the process. So if you put them all together, this is pretty much what you have. Each wave 8 to 10 years. And it's a very clear hierarchy in the diffusion process. It's interesting. It starts with a triad. It perfectly matches the process of globalization. You see it coming alive because you see all those different waves, different players coming in the game, be involved in trade and import and export. So you see it coming until the last elements, the last pieces, these days have been placed over very specific niche markets. So that's, in a sense, the observation behind this. So 5 waves and 2 waves of subwaves. The only difference, in those 2 waves, they're exactly the same, but simply one started up mid-70s, the other one started a little bit later. It's simply that within the wave there was the startup, and then a little bit of the other were lagging behind it, but they started a little bit later on. Same thing with the China wave. Initial late 1990s and late early 2000s. Simply same growth, but simply a little bit more further in time. Okay. Here's a question. You ride the wave. You're a cool dude, okay? Until you reach an inflection point where the wave collapses on you. In that case, and that's a question that I think this guy is actually, the answer is clear for this one. He has reached an inflection point when he can no longer ride the wave and move on to some kind of paradigm shift here, which is the paradigm shift is pretty much falling off. So let's look this up. So to do that, what we've looked at is simply a simple shift-share analysis. By this I mean, if growth was continuous and uniform, each port will continue to grow and keep their share of the global market. But of course, this never happens. So when you have paradigm shift, when you have changes, you have ports that loses. In terms of their share, they still can grow traffic-wise. It's entirely possible. And there are some ports that are gaining. And we start to measure these winners and losers. So for 2000, 2005, this is what we are observing, in a sense. North America massively loses share. Again, growth continues, but loses share. And all the growth is here where you have the green taking place. You see here, of course, along the Asia-Europe route, South Asia, in particular Middle East. Of course, along the coast of China, and I find it very revealing. The tigers all went to China, in a sense. So Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and even the Philippines, the growth, the share of those ports dramatically shifted. So it means that there was a rebalancing of the manufacturing taking place at that point, which you can observe in container traffic. And then we look at somewhat at the impact of the financial crisis. We look at 2005, 2010. Fairly similar pattern. Again, North America, Europe, continues to lose. What I found interesting is Singapore. Again, we have to look it up why it lost a very significant share. And we saw, yeah, I put that big green arrow for the Americas. You start to see the Panama effect. Panama is now as big as New York in terms of container volume. Just 6-7 years ago, it was some kind of a fluke. So again, it's something really, really interesting taking place in this part of the world. Again, to see, it tells you there's some changes in the dynamics, that because some ports, their relative weight is changing. And there's and the fun part, there's a geographical pattern. There are clusters of changes. Yes?
So in the previous slide, you were showing there's an increase in containerization share in like India and Arabian Peninsula. Does that mean like their share of international trade is increasing compared to someone like United States? Or
you have to be very careful.
What does that mean?
That could be. I'm simply mentioning here their share of global containerized trade is increasing.
So the number
more than the United
containers
States.
they're
It
handling-
could grow. So that's the point. So you have to be very careful about these interpretations.
They're relatively small share again.
Yes, that's the issue, but you have anything to gain. But still, to start to have those big circles, you have to have big numbers. Because otherwise, it's going to be a small share. It's not about percentage growth, it's about share of global containerized trade. Yes.
Is it,
I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Is it production shifts that are creating the containerization shifts? And is that derived from Chinese and American going to lower labor in Africa, perhaps?
We're not there yet. As Africa is not there, it could be. There's some action taking place here, I must say. But to go back to this, it is you have to be careful. One is production related, manufacturing related. The other one is transshipment hub related. So more shift in manufacturing and transshipment hub positioning themselves as major logistic platforms. Yes.
For a while, I was thinking that perhaps you were going towards supply and demand. That as the demand for containerization diminishes for whatever reasons, economic or otherwise, then the supply goes down and they lose the market share or the global share. But maybe not. I'm just wondering, have you determined what are the factors that cause these cycles? Or is that what you're working on?
That's what we're working on. Again, here I'm playing the pattern, I'm depicting the trend. But I can only, in the paper, we speculate about the causes of the respective phases. And that can bring us to the initial slide I was pointing out. What are the factors of global, is it a derived demand, is it substitution, and so on and so forth. So, and I suspect it's a very dynamic process. In many cases, it's simply because there's more global trade. In other places, we're repositioning more empties. It's we're a transshipment hub. That's why we're growing. In other places, going to say we're growing because we have a massive process of commodities being moving containers, and now people being used for that purpose.
Have you been able to identify at least potential variables that cause these cycles?
Yes.
What are they?
The cycles?
The causes, the potential causes of the cycles, yes.
Fundamentally, I would suspect it's global labor costs and comparative advantages. And it's classic international trade and economic theory that will drive this. Plus, to this simplistic representation, you must have the decision of supply chain managers, of major manufacturers, say, okay, we have a Pearl River Delta strategy. Now we're switching to a Mexico strategy, and so on and so forth. Again, it's excessively complex, and that's the point I would like to make. We can observe the growth, we can speculate about it, but so far we have not fundamentally assessed in a rigorous manner what derives a lot of it. Okay, we have a good idea, of course, it's trade and it's offshoring, outsourcing, but to measure it specifically, and if we knew, we could get a little bit more planning, a little bit more better at forecasting it in a sense.
Just a little 10-year cycles, or the cycle lengths as we change. Is it going to be cost effective to move all this stuff around? Is it going to happen more frequently? Is it going to stabilize where it is because they learned their lesson? The salaries went up in China in a 10, 15-year period. So where are they going to move to next? And is that worth the 10
That's the point. That's the point. Stuff are moving to Vietnam, Southeast Asia. Now there's starting to be more of an Africa strategy. And when you start to have this and you have hundreds, if not thousands, of people making decisions about the production, it starts to influence trade. In this case here, we can only observe it, try to measure it, assess in what type of pattern it fits. But I wish I could answer that, because if I was able to do that, I would be able to have a better, much better understanding of the drivers of port activity around the world. And we've been trying to do that for quite a long time, but semi-successfully. This is simply a list of who's in the list about the highest gain for these period, highest decline. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I'm starting to be running out of time. So let's look at the now the short waves of containerization. And I say the question is, am I a gateway or a transshipment hub? So that's a cute little one, I must say. So we start to look. We took a sample of ports, and it's very interesting. What we observe is some ports, they put all the statistics out there. Thank you. I love transparency. I call Antwerp. Sorry, I won't give you monthly traffic because there's Rotterdam. So it's very strange. So it's very difficult to get. Some ports are completely open. They put their stuff right out there. Just Google it. You're going to find everything that happens on a monthly basis. No problem. Some other ports, even they're going to lag their release of statistics for 3 or 4, 5 years. So then when you have secrecy, it tells you there's something strange.
Well, it's hard to get the financial data because we like to do benchmarking studies and you can't get it.
So it's tough. So we were able to find a few samples. We got a few phone calls, and some are more open than others. And we just, for fun, we say, let's look at the short wave cycles. And this is where you get what we call the Christmas ports. Classic example, Los Angeles and New York. You get systematically which is of course completely linked with retail cycles. As simple as that. It reflects very well the dynamism of the North American economy. And we didn't find that much growth, interestingly. And then we look at Singapore. And in this case, TI is the transshipment index. That is, what is the share of the traffic which is transshipment? In both cases, it was almost zero, or zero. And then we look at Singapore, we look at Algeciras, we have a very high transshipment function. And in this case, the monthly traffic, the seasonality was fairly stable, fairly. However, you get yourself paradigm shift. Hiccup, that was the financial crisis, and here you go. And here, Algeciras, again, you see some volatility, but somewhat stable, and then suddenly MERS decided to move from Transshipment back. So you have a shipping line that decides to change its strategy, and suddenly your situation, you get yourself your paradigm shift. You will not get that much such events in these places. You see it here, of course, with the financial crisis, but then with the thing got back to the usual pulse, I must say. But in the other part, so that's interesting. The observation is transshipment hub, traffic-wise, has a fairly stable seasonality until somebody makes a decision, and then things shift. But with regular port, you have these Christmas type of things. Again, we look at Hong Kong, a Christmas port. This is where you can set your clock about it. Busan, same thing. Antwerp, again, those were hybrid because Antwerp is also a transshipment hub, interestingly. And again, some form of stability plus those little paradigm shifts. Again, it's really tough to get some more specific patterns here. But again, they tend to be fairly stable. So that, again, different waves. Again, how can you reconcile the dynamism of these waves with the longer term? It's very different processes. You cannot correlate them. They link with the seasonality of the economy or their role and function within global shipping networks. So as a conclusion, actually 55 minutes. I'm good. I work in logistics and supply chain. For me, I have a very keen concept of time. For me, the utmost is to be late. It's the supreme insult. And I tend to run my presentation, hopefully from a clockwork perspective. Okay, so are we reaching peak containerization? Question mark, because I'm not completely sure about this. So keep in mind, The container is a technology in a sense. It's a technique. Like anything else in human history, it gets adopted, it gets diffused, and when everybody gets it, and when it's everywhere, you reach a peak. So the point is, do we have evidence to underline that we have reached a form of peak containerization? I would guess in North America and Europe, I would say semi-confidently yes. So I found 5 successive waves we were able to statistically demonstrate. They were medium wave, which were able to assess where we got inflection points, a change in the dynamics. And then, of course, unrelated short waves that were completely linked with the function of if you were a transshipment hub or not. And that's pretty much what I can say about this tonight. So, thank you very much.
We have questions. Yes, we do.
Have you, getting the data may be more trouble than it's worth, have you looked at sort of like the evolution of rail lines in the United States? Because it seems to me you're going to see a similar sort of pattern starting after the Civil War up through, you know, its heyday and the Second World War.
I have a table on my website actually, which I plot the extent of the North American rail system for 150 years, and then it went down, and now we're going through some form of renaissance of rail, more investment, and is it a new wave? Possibly. So there are other things. Yeah, you're right. Rail matches a little bit, but it's very tough to get other form of data from rail. If you ask them about their terminal volumes, they're going to say get lost. It's frustrating, but I know they're a private company over private network, and they don't advertise too much their data.
I was just curious. Back in the slide that we had, pork roast, there's one dot that absolutely amazed me. It was in the middle of Brazil. There was a green dot.
Oh yes, yes.
And that just kind of struck me as very interesting.
This is not a geocoding error. This is the port. It's a port in the middle of the Amazon basin. It's actually it's connected with deep sea maritime services, but to Brazilian port. It's not directly connected to international. What's the name? I'm sorry, I forgot. But there's a port there, and it grown because of the dynamism of the Amazonian basin. So it's linked with guess what, the commodities and the lumber sector and so on and so forth. And it was a container port which released. Is it Iquitos? No. Well, I will get back to you with the exact name. I'm sorry about it. Yeah, but it's booming. It's a town which is booming, so there's a fair amount of imports, so equipment, consumer goods, also exporting commodities from the Amazon. But again, it goes through Brazilian ports, and then it's going to reach to a transshipment hub, and then goes to the international market. I do not see yet so far direct maritime service. That may change. If the volume is big enough. Yes.
Yeah, this is related to the transshipment dynamics. So have you, I'm sure you have, have you identified specific points in time when there have been these major changes in distribution paradigms and sort of verified those inflection points or major changes in patterns of medium and short waves and sort of related them to those changes?
We have done a lot of work on transshipment hub. I can direct you to a paper we wrote about this, but we have not looked at the wave effect. I can only tell you from certain a transshipment hub is at the whim of the major maritime shipping companies that are using it. But a good point is the global terminal operators that are operating those transshipment hubs sometimes are parent firms of global shipping companies. So there's a concordance there.
Right, but what are the points when there have been these major changes in these dynamics?
Of course, the paradigm shift is we observe is obvious. Is first of all the financial crisis. Duh. The other one is, again, this one is very more random, is when a maritime shipping company makes a decision. And that could be linked with port issues, labor. I'll give an example. Algeciras, it's because Tangier, there was labor problem. Tangier is in Morocco. It was a brand new transshipment hub, very attracted some traffic. Maersk went there, a few other companies went there. I think it's operated by APM, and it's operated by another European operator. Eurogate. Again, I cannot remember, but what was the issue? There was a labor problem, and they simply went across the Strait of Gibraltar. You can just wave. Again, so those are very tough to model because it's a shipping company decided to change their, let's say we're going to call this transshipment level less because there's something that's not. In that case, you have to look at very local issues.
Or even technological innovations in supply chain management and the changes, major changes in those. In
How
the
they
management, right? And how that impacts and affects these.
It could also be a takeover, a merger.
Right.
And again, right now the big alliances, they might decide, they might shift their trench, or you can see some readjustment. Again, that's the outcome of a commercial decision of rationalization. But how this is going to pan itself out in Transshipment Hub, if you find out, please let me know. Because I would like to know. They know, but they won't reveal too quickly about this. This is where those ships are going to go and how they're going to be assigned. It remains to be interesting. But those decisions have been made.
Thank you.
Yes?
Earlier in the slides, you mentioned that derived growth was essentially exhausted at this point. You're looking at other means for driving movements. But then you also tentatively admitted that one of the major factors for these changing movements was this labor cost changes. And how does population growth and projections and different dynamics in global country sizes affect that movement as well?
The point is, it's not that much demography that plays. It's the GDP per capita, because it's linked with spending power, which will have a substantial impact on containerized demand. So the link between demography and containerized demand is somewhat tenuous, but you can measure it in terms of their bang for the buck, in a sense, in terms of GDP per capita. But the point is that when you have a large population, you have small growth in GDP, you start to have significant multiplying effect, which we're starting to observe, of course, in India. We start to observe, for instance, in Colombia. We start to observe this in Peru, a few Latin American countries, which start a very interesting bang for the buck, I must say. But demography-wise, if you look population strictly, I don't think you're going to find that much correlation.
So the economic output of that demographic.
Yeah, it would be more likely. Again, I'm speculating about this. I've not done the analysis itself, but I'm fairly confident about it. Yes?
I guess sort of piggybacking on what you said, because you said recently China has not been, they're not the hub of labor as they used to be. And as we see new transportation containerization hubs continue with labor, so are you saying where labor cost is low, is that where newer hubs, is that the trend? Are you talking about?
You have to be careful. It's just not. That's what's political. There are several factors that you can measure, for instance, with the HDI, Human Development Index. You have to be very careful about this, otherwise all the global manufacturing will be taking place somewhere in Africa, in this case. But it might get there. But the point is that for a big share of the global container trade, it was labor cost differential that was a very interesting, powerful driver. The point is, it seems that this factor is eroding more and more as we move, of course, as everybody else is climbing up the supply chain, added value, and so on and so forth. So China, the China labor effect, I must say, has been fairly played out. There's still some left, I'm quite sure, of course. You can never discount China. It's a gigantic elephant, whatever you name it, it's going to be a major factor. But I think the peak years, as far as that game are fairly done. The point will be now how China is going to strategize this. What will be the growth factor? It's going to be internal consumption now, domestic demand, as opposed to simply let's manufacture stuff cheap and export processing zone and just you bring empty container in, you just bring them inland 1, 2, or 3 miles, fill them up, send them back to the port, and then they're on their way across the Pacific. Yes.
I'm just wondering how the increase in labor wages in developing country or the increase in transportation costs due to the price of oil plus the nearshoring affect the supply chain. Does it have any actually change the direction of the transportation or?
I must say the question you ask is a very speculative question because a lot of people are wondering about that. Because when you talk about the price of oil, there's so many ramifications. You can go all the way down to bunker fuels, which creates slow steaming, which means the ships are now going slower. And if you manage supply chain with slow steaming, you're annoyed because now what used to take, let's say, 14 days, take 15, 16, 17 days. And now you have to have more inventory. It plays in all sorts of strange little ways, I must say. And initially, when you got a peak in oil prices, you remember in 2007, 2008, when it was funny times, I must say. I was starting to wonder what the heck is going to happen now with supply chains in light of this and trade. But the point is, transportation cost is such a small component of the total cost that it seems to be very resilient. It seems that the cost of moving things around is not that mattered too much for what I've been observing so far, especially when you have the ongoing process of economies of scale. And now the new post-Panamax ships coming up, or the new Panamax ship coming up. So again, we're still very confused about this one because energy prices plays itself out. It does not impact transportation costs too much as far as maritime shipping is concerned, not too much. Still, it's 50% of operation cost. It impacts on the speed. We didn't see that one coming, I must say. We didn't see I didn't see slow steaming coming. But it was, and when you think about it, it was logical. Yes. Last, okay.
This gentleman behind there, who is his hand too. But I wanted to ask, so one of the reasons that ports or the regional planning agencies like to use linear regression for the future forecast is there's a federal funding tied to how significant our region is. Like, unless we make a compelling argument that, hey, if Southern California fails to handle all those, the current container volume or future projected volume, then the entire United States economy will collapse. So, but based on, well, whether you believe it or not, that's another story, but based on your research findings, it's starting to get to the plateau. So that actually is going to, and let's say if that's going to happen, then it's going to cripple our ability to secure future funding for our transportation projects. So if you were to pitch a proposal to maybe change how the federal transportation funds are allocated to local jurisdictions, not only to Southern California, but for across the country, what would you say?
You just gave me a nice little minefield, and I'm very reluctant to step in it because there will be some limbs blowing off here and there. I see your point. It's very comforting when you use forecasting to lie. No, give me money, I'm going to tell you all the lies you want to hear. I'm being very sarcastic, but I'm not too far from reality in a sense. The only point I would like to make is this, okay, containerized has been a very important driver, but think about this. If the trade stabilizes, it doesn't mean that the economy is, it means, actually could be meaning that the American economy is now more dynamic inside. Since we're less, and what is an important export might have a much higher value. Because I'm not that happy to see all this retail good, a very low value retail good coming in. Why they're doing that? Because it was some kind of a window of opportunity because China was there for 20 years. I would prefer to say we try with China, we import rare earths or something very high value because and then we exchange something else of very high value, which means that the economy itself it could be very highly dynamic. So you have to be very careful to link port throughput with economic. Of course, if you import and export oriented, you're right. It's going to be very strongly correlated. If you're a gateway such as LA, you're right. When the 50% or more of your business is pretty much what's going on outside California, deep inside America, you're right. You're concerned. You're concerned about this. But I can only tell you that when those dynamics going to play themselves out, think about the 3D printing. That's a very what will be the impact of this form of manufacturing on global supply chain? We might be 5 to 10 years, we might be quite surprised. And you might say Fortune, America 2.5, you know, a new dynamism in America, suddenly America is hyper competitive. But again, I don't want to step into policy regarding this, and at least not publicly. I have my opinion. I have my point of view, but it's. I know from your point. I understand your discourse and your concern.
No, because I think your findings are very compelling. And I don't want to say we've been drinking Kool-Aid in Southern California, especially with Jen and Geraldine in the room. But
you're drinking Kool-Aid.
At the same time, like if you do so much research and have all those compelling facts that's pointing us to a different direction from what we've been going, and if we don't turn that into some kind of policy direction, I mean.
Okay. The point I would like to make simply here is, from my perspective, I don't expect that much continue ongoing growth in container traffic in the United States, at least from a port perspective. It's going to be a rebalancing. Okay, it's going to be. I would not say a zero-sum game, but somewhat like that a little bit. Unless what I know about the dynamism of the American economy changed, but we are about to enter another recession, in my opinion. Yeah. We have I don't, and things are not good that great, but I would not like to be in European shoes. They have also demographic crisis. I would not like to be in Japan shoes. They're going to be in far worse situation as far as than we are. But again, you're right. If you were thinking about if all your policies were oriented toward promoting trade and containerization, and the dynamism appears to be shifting, again, I might be just monitoring a fluke here, and in 5 years you can completely laugh about what I was saying. I was completely wrong, but I'm not too sure.
Yeah, no, I'm not trying to promote containerization. I just want to have like those sound bites that we might be able to use in the future to approach to the federal government. Hey, maybe you should change your formula funding allocation.
But you know, right now we got an overcapacity in LA Long Beach. You got 2 empty terminals in Long Beach. You know, where Long Beach is investing $4.5 billion in 5 years, and we're not seeing any organic growth. We got ruthless competition between 2 ports, stuff is just moving back and forth between LA and Long Beach. That's what's happening.
It's a zero-sum game.
So yeah, right,
So
exactly.
The goal should be efficiency, not
Yeah,
growth.
efficiency.
Time efficiency to get this stuff
Right.
across the country to remain competitive.
There's a terminal under construction in Long Beach that can handle half of the volume of the entire port of Long Beach. One terminal, because it's fully automated.
But it will.
It's going to take a
And
long
so-
time to fill.
No, exactly.
No,
but
substitute.
Who's paying for it?
once these alliances move forward and they're trying to make decisions, you could see consolidation in the terminals too. And right now everybody wants an automated terminal, but we probably need 2 in LA and 2 in Long Beach, and that's it.
But the point, you made a valid point. It's going to be promoting efficiency, promoting reliability. Again, you have to climb up the value chain in one way or the other. You have to move up simply being an handler of freight. And it's easier said than done. That's also, you ask about policy, about, okay, how do you articulate in this policy? And this is where I start to be, can I say that? I'm not that much. But I'm currently doing a project for the Inter-American Development Bank about logistic development strategies, but mostly Latin America and Panama and Colombia. And again, they ask the same question. Yeah, they have similar concerns about this. So what is the value of the pie we're going to get, in a sense, and is it going to change or not? But again, the growth years appear to be behind us. I think that the fast growth year.
Okay, I know we